Welcome to Broadcasting Common Ground, the Deep Foundation Institute's podcast channel. In this series, Deep Dive, host Tim Siegel will dig deep into a variety of topics related to pile foundations alongside experienced members of the industry.
Welcome to DFI's podcast, Broadcasting Common Ground. I'm Tim Siegel, and it's my pleasure to be here with the introductory episode of our series Deep Dive, Part 2. In our first part, we had Kyle Rollins, and we talked about subjects such as pile testing and lateral pile behavior. We welcome Kyle once again, and now we'll look at some other parts of deep foundation behavior. Hi, Kyle.
Hi, good to be with you, Tim.
Hey, welcome back. So we'll jump right into it. And I'll encourage our listeners, if they haven't listened to our part 1, to go back at some later time. But what I'd like to talk about is blast-induced liquefaction. And I'll start by saying I remember meeting you, which was probably for the first time in Charleston in the late 1990s. And I was working as a consultant for SNME, but particularly I was working with Dan Brown on the design of the load test program for the Cooper River Bridge. And you were introduced to me, as well as your colleague, Professor Scott Ashford, as the experts in blast-induced liquefaction. So maybe give us a little background. How did you get introduced to blast-induced liquefaction, and how did that develop within your career?
Yeah, that Cooper River Bridge project was only our second project involving blast-induced liquefaction. So it was kind of the wild, wild west for us, exploring how to do things. We'd done it once before for a series of lateral pile load tests at Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay. We are trying to find a way to test piles in liquefied sand at full scale, but that's harder to do than you might imagine. We don't want to just instrument piles and wait for an earthquake to occur and hope everything's working. So I'd read a paper that Roman Ritsu at University of Michigan wrote, and it was talking about some vibro-sized trucks that liquefied the ground and caused a slope failure. I thought maybe I could do that, get some of these vibro-sized trucks and mount them or shake them around the piles. And I talked to Roman, and he suggested that I consider using explosives. I thought, wow, that sounds fun, but it also sounds like good luck trying to get access to sites. He said, no, I think you can do it. I think we could do it. It's practical to do it. So we eventually arranged with that the U.S. Navy was in the process of transferring Treasure Island over to the city of San Francisco, and I had worked with the Navy Civil Engineering Laboratory in Port Hueneme, and I used all my influence to try and it got us approval to use that test site. And so it was kind of, we knew it had liquefied in a past earthquake, the Loma Prieta earthquake, and the Navy was willing to let us use it. So we started there. It was sponsored by Caltrans and a number of state departments of transportation. And so we gave it a whirl. We hired licensed blasters to help us. Les Youd had developed pore pressure transducers that you could install in the ground and give you constant readout of pore pressure versus time. But the difficulty was that the correlations we could see said that blast pressures might be as high as 5,000 or 6,000 psi, but we wanted to measure excess pore pressures down to 0.1 psi. So I would call I would call the manufacturers of the pore pressure transducers and tell them my requirements, and they'd start laughing. They thought it was the funniest thing that I was asking for that. We contacted everyone we could find, and we finally got somebody that said that they thought they could do it, and so they supplied us with this. And we went to Treasure Island and set off just single explosives to see if the pore pressures would generate, and then we set off a couple. Then we set off a ring of explosives, and it was working. We were getting excess pore pressures of 100%. So then we did it on a pilot test with 2 rings to see if we could generate liquefaction and how long it would last. And we were able to generate pore pressures down to about 15 feet, and maybe in these 2 rings, which were about 14-foot diameter, we could get maybe a 40-foot long zone of liquefied soils. And so we were in business. So we tested 2 single piles against each other, a H pile and a pipe pile, steel pipe. And then we had a 4-pile group of steel pipe piles loaded against a 2-foot diameter drilled shaft, and a 9-pile group loaded against a 3-foot drilled shaft. So these are like 3 separate tests where we're doing this work. So we would go through the process of getting all the instrumentation in place, get all the piles ready to go, the loading system, which is 2 high-speed hydraulic actuators from UC San Diego at the time, and the pump systems, everything working, all the instrumentation in place. And then we got the blasters would come out, put everything ready to go, and then it was hope everything works for the next 10 or 15 minutes. So it was pretty crazy time, but surprisingly it came together, and we got some what I think are pretty worthwhile results, which has now become kind of these curves are incorporated in L-pile and group, so people can use them if they'd like to.
And those are the ones from Treasure Island.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we had those from Treasure Island. We updated our procedure based on some additional tests that we did with you in South Carolina, and it seemed to work okay. The way we got involved in South Carolina was that SCDOT called Caltrans and said that they have this potential liquefaction problem at the Cooper River Bridge site. And they said, "What would you do?" And the design engineer for Caltrans said, "Well, we use full-scale testing with blast-induced liquefaction." We had just barely finished the test, so they gave us a call, and we mobilized all our equipment and personnel to go out there and do the test with you.
That was fantastic.
But it was a pretty wild time. And you'll remember that we had the statnamic lateral load system was just being used for the first few times, and Applied Foundation Testing brought their system out, and so we had a little runway that could slide on, and as launched, and we'd set off the explosives, and then we would
No, if I'm
fire the statnamic.
I'm convinced, Kyle, if YouTube was around back then, we would all be millionaires, because that particular video went viral. I mean, I can remember seeing it. I can remember having it on my computer. And then even years later, I remember like sitting in a conference and somebody goes, and now I'm going to show you of a blast-induced liquefaction with, lateral statnamic. And it was our video. I'm like, I know that video. Hey, that's us. And I was like, anyway, it's that was a big deal back then.
Yeah, it was a pretty big deal.
Having all the screaming in the background, a guy counting down. I remember it was somebody had the 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, bam, 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 bam.
Yeah.
That was fun.
I went to a meeting in Japan one time, and they had I think we had like 8 or 16 blast holes or something like that, 16 charges going off. And the Japanese had instrumented a whole slope with different ground improvement strategies and piles and pipelines and everything. And they had hundreds of holes that they were detonated. And he said, "Kyle, your baby has grown up."
That's great. Oh,
Pretty fun to be in on that to start with.
Well, I learned something now. So, like I said, I think Dan probably referred to you and Scott Ashford as the 2 foremost authorities on blast-induced liquefaction, which I guess was that a little bit of a slight embellishment on Dan's part, that it was also your second blast-induced liquefaction.
Yeah, we'd learn pretty fast. I think that's how geotechnical engineers
That's
are.
right. That's right.
They have to find something that's going to work, and
that's funny.
And then they become the expert there. Yeah.
Well. Move us to more recent work. You and I have talked a little bit about the work you're doing in Italy, and I think our listeners would like to kind of get a sense of what you've been working on and some of the interesting things you found.
We did those 2 sets of tests on laterally loaded piles and pile groups, and that allowed us to get some general equations for dealing with different diameters and different densities of soil and so forth. But the thing that attracted our attention was the behavior of piles in liquefied soil during down drag, right? Liquefaction-induced down drag. And there were some people that were just ignoring it. This it's not really an issue. Others that were accounting for it and needing huge increases of factor of safety or of pile lengths or diameters to make things work. And so I thought, well, we know how to do this, so let's see if we can test some piles and find out what happens. So we went to Vancouver, British Columbia, and we had a test pile there. We had a load frame, and we were applying an axial load. So we set the explosive charges off, and we had loaded the pile up to 1/2 of its load capacity based on Davison criteria. And as soon as the load went off, we were trying to, like we were talking about in the last episode of this, we were trying to keep the load constant. So immediately there was enough settlement that we lost about 40 kips of load on the pile. And we turned on the jacks. It took us 17 seconds to get the load reapplied. And since we were reapplying the load, it produced positive skin friction at the top of the pile going down to, and it was, as you looked at the load versus depth, it was the same depth that would require you to get to, the skin friction was 40 kips. So we reloaded the top part, and then we continued to keep it reloaded. And so we got this strange looking curve that showed positive friction at the top and then going downward, and then negative skin friction in the liquefied soil after it had reconsolidated.
Interesting.
So our big concern was that looks like such a strange thing. We think we could explain what was going on, that we're reloading. But we had a chance in New Zealand to where we could put a static load on top of it. It was we could put a 300 kip load on, or 300 ton load on top of 3 2-foot diameter auger cast piles. So we had a frame that would hold this in place. And you can, since we didn't want to have to reload it, we wanted to have a static dead weight load. So we had
Right, not a jack. This is
not a
just
jack,
dead weight.
just a dead weight. So we've got a dead weight on top of there, and it was chained up and sitting on this frame. The piles were at different diameters or different depths. So one was supposed to terminate in the liquefied soil, and 2 would go through it. So I got quite worried that the whole thing might just tip over. I'd moved as much weight as I could to the piles on the side where it went through the liquefied zone. And I got to the test site on Monday morning, and a prominent engineer was telling people that, and then told me, this whole thing is going to tip over, Kyle, as soon as those explosives go off. So I don't know what you want to do, but you better do something. And I couldn't think of anything else to do, so I'd done as good as I could, and it was pretty much an indeterminate thing. So we just left it. Everyone said, hey, we can get cranes out here. We can change this. We can take things off. And, but we just left it. The explosives went off. It stayed up, a little bit of tilt, but it stayed together. And then in this case, we saw the typical thing you'd expect. The load started at the top, and we got negative friction in the non-liquefied layer above the liquefied zone. And as immediately after the blast, we have almost a vertical load versus depth curve, saying that there's no resistance in the liquefied soil. And then shortly after that, as the sand in the liquefied zone reconsolidated, the pore pressure went down, the soil settled, the effective stress increased, and the shear stress on the soil in the liquefied zone started to create a negative or a downward friction, even in the liquefied soil. Mm-hmm. And people weren't really considering that as a possibility at the time, but that's what we saw in the measurements. And then we had to increase the load. That caused increased load at the bottom of the pile, which caused it some additional settlement. So that was when we went back to calculate what the skin friction was in the liquefied layer after reconsolidation. The negative friction was about 50% of the positive skin friction that we had before liquefaction. And so that's not a lot of load tests to base a design approach on. We had some data at in Vancouver and some in New Zealand. But over time, we've gotten some more opportunities to do the testing, and I think we're up to around 16 to 20 test piles now where we're seeing this similar kind of behavior, where we see a negative friction or downward friction after the soil liquefies and then starts moving downward relative to the soil or relative to the pile of about 50%.
I remember seeing a presentation from you. It's a few years ago. Maybe I'm sure you've thought about this, but did you still see some elevated pore water pressure in that sand zone, or do you think it was back to hydrostatic?
It's gone basically back down to hydrostatic pressures at the end of the reconsolidation process. I think we ran things out to where we were maybe about 10% or less.
Do you think that are these all driven piles or some of them drilled? Is there a chance that you kind of loosened the sand right up against the pile? I'm just thinking out loud. I don't know.
There's a possibility for sure. Yeah, there's
But
possibility.
50, right at 50% seems like, is it always dense sand or is it even loose sand that gets cut by 50%?
It's variable. So there's different densities and fines contents. We've tested a driven steel pipe pile. We've tested auger cast piles. We've tested drilled shafts with Rick Kaufman out on the Mississippi, and different types of precast concrete piles, driven steel pipe, H piles. That's not always, it's like you'd expect, it's geotechnical problem. It's not 50%. It's ranges from somewhere between 40 and 60%, but 50 is a good average value for what we're seeing. It's a complicated problem because you've got sand that's liquefied, so its structure has been messed up, and then it's reconsolidating, turning from a fluid back into a solid again.
Right.
And the pore pressures are going from 100% to, or close to,
whatever,
back to zero. And then there's settlement of the pile relative to the surrounding soil. So you got a lot going on there. So you're going to expect some variability, but
certainly you think there's some installation effects and maybe some movement. I don't know. Is there something that occurs onto the interface between the pile and the sand when you get this large movement that you can't recapture? You know what I mean? Is it like almost like a strain softening or a strain weakening kind? I don't know. And is that where the movement occurs? I guess and I don't remember where I learned this, and maybe I didn't learn it correctly, but that some folks argue that the failure plane isn't against the pile, against the soil, but it's somewhere in the soil. I don't know. So I don't know. Does it redirect the failure plane? I don't know.
Yeah. All these are possibilities, right? And the one thing we haven't done very well is we haven't. It would be really nice to be able to have had that pile sit there in New Zealand where we had a dead weight on it, and to have that stay in place for a month or two, where we could see if a static neutral plane would develop.
Right.
But we've not had that luxury. We've gone to Italy most recently because you have to find a place where you can do a test where you have soil that's going to liquefy and where people will allow you to do it, that aren't afraid that you're going to cause some damage to adjacent structures or you're not going to annoy neighbors and things like this. So we've gone to sites near Bologna, Italy. They're just out on a farmer's field, and in an earthquake in 2012, this soil liquefied, so we know it's liquefiable material. The municipality is willing to work with us. We've done it a few times, so they trust us that we're not going to cause a problem. So that's why we're going there. Well, it's a nice place to go on.
Yeah, they're really roughing it.
Yeah. But,
of course, it's probably a better flight than New Zealand.
Yeah, a lot shorter, and you can take some equipment with you. The biggest problem is getting approval to do a site. One time we had some blast-induced liquefaction tests we were going to do in Maui, and we were flying into Maui. We landed. I got a phone call on my cell phone, said, bad news. We've talked to our lawyers and they don't think we can allow you to do this test. This is the fight you get in with
blasting.
Eventually we worked it out, but it's always hard. So if someone will let us do it in these sites in Italy, we're we're all in. So the,
Yeah.
the most recent thing we've been doing in Italy is looking at groups of piles in liquefied sand. So we had a contractor, Geofondazioni is the name of the company, and they build tapered piles. So I don't know how common that is in the United States. Have you worked on projects with tapered piles at all, Tim?
You know, Kyle, the only experiences that I mean, I always heard of Raymond's step tapered piles as a
Yeah,
foundation type, but I've never worked on one. And then, you know, certainly there was an ASC magazine that, you know, pretty common ad that showed these tapered piles, but I don't
yeah,
think they're widely, I mean, they may be regional. I've
yeah,
not worked on one.
yeah. So the idea of the tapered piles is that they get higher side friction because you're not just straight friction, you have a little bit of a passive component on the side as well. And so they were willing to put in about 25 piles for us, and we had a group of 13 piles. So we could look at 5 rows on a diagonal. And then we also had single piles on, we had 4 single piles we could test. So one of the single piles we could put with a jack, we could apply a load to it. The other 2, there was no load on top of them. And then the group of piles had no applied load at the head. They were just in a group, and there was no pile cap. So ideally, we'd like to have a pile cap with a load on top of it, but we can take what we can get in this case. So we used our explosives, got a contract licensed blaster. We loaded the one single pile and then set off the explosives. But again, we got liquefied soil in a zone from about 5 meters to 13 meters. So
That's a lot.
Yeah. And then they went down into a non-liquefied layer below it. Okay. So this time we didn't try to keep the load constant at the pile head. I just told them, let it do whatever it's going to do. It will come to equilibrium. And as soon as the blast went off, almost immediately, within a few seconds, we had almost a vertical load versus deflection or load versus depth curve in the liquefied soil, indicating we have very little side friction as the soil liquefied. Okay. We did have okay, then as time goes on and the soil starts to dissipate, the liquefied soil starts to settle as pore pressures go away, effective stress increases, negative downward skin friction develops in the non-liquefied soil above the liquefied layer, and it also develops negative friction in the liquefied zone. That increases the load that has to get transferred to the non-liquefied soil at the base. Probably better if we had a little diagram to try and explain this, but
No, keep going.
and then we have positive skin friction below the liquefied layer in the non-liquefied soil, and an increase in toe resistance at the base. So we had even though these were vibrating wire devices, we had a monitoring system that could record about as fast as you could pick it and get a reasonable value off of it. So we have a pretty good record of what's going on, and it shows that this is pretty consistent. And it came to equilibrium. We had negative friction all the way from the top down to the neutral plane, and positive friction from the bottom, from the neutral plane on down. And the load, since we had a static load test performed, we had a pretty good idea of the QZ curve of the toe of the pile, the end bearing or the toe resistance versus toe displacement. And it matches up pretty nicely with the load that's now transferred to the toe of the pile and the settlement that we had in the pile. So things seem to fit together pretty well. The load versus depth curves for this single pile, if you subtract off the axial load part at the top, matches what we have from the other two that are didn't have any load on top of them. Same kind of behavior. But of course there are variations, but they're not too strange. It's a geotechnical problem, different variations in soil and so forth, and pore pressures probably. But it gives us pretty good consistency, and to think we're on track with what's going on. We came back after 1 day after the blast and did a static load test on a pile that had not been loaded previously. And we only got about 50% of the ultimate capacity that we had originally from the test. So 1 day after the event, the pore pressures, even though they had dissipated to zero, the soil structure hadn't regrouped enough, reestablished itself to where we redeveloped the full side resistance. We came back 2 months later and did the test again and on another pile. And we're seeing we're getting closer, but even after 2 months, we still haven't redeveloped the full side friction in the soil that liquefied to get back to where it was originally for positive skin friction.
That was one thing that I didn't mention on our previous part one, and that is when we talk about pile resistance, we talk about setup and driven piles, but whether pile time and also whether that pile's been loaded previously, I think you have to include those things when you're really talking about capacity. And you make a good point. This isn't really even setup. It's basically the inverse of setup. The soil, the pile has been there. It's just the soil around it's been changed. You said you tested it after you induced the liquefaction, got 50% the capacity, and then you locate it again and you're getting closer.
Yeah.
I'm going to assume that it's fair to say that every time you load tested it, you got rid of the negative skin friction, that all of the side resistance was positive, correct?
Yeah, good point. I should have mentioned that. Yeah, so now we're loading from the top down, and now we have only positive friction. But the skin friction in the liquefied layer
reversed again.
Now it's going up. It's resisting the downward movement. So part of that could be due to that behavior. But it makes you a little nervous that you may not get that capacity back again for
I think some
period of time.
I mean, I think that's very meaningful. Especially, if the consideration is for structures that want to be post-earthquake proof, basically, and that's one of those gray areas in our industry. We design for a very, rare earthquake, but most times we say all we want is life safety, people to get out of there.
Yeah.
And then the question is, people are like, well, what happens afterwards? Can they move back in? And then it becomes, I mean, other than things like hospitals or possibly schools, but now, or fire stations or something, some critical structure. But those are good questions for our society to have. The two aspects that I had alluded to, one was you had mentioned looking at the ground surface profile in the groups. And the other that you had alluded to was the fact that you may not have gotten, let's say, complete liquefaction with a R sub U of 1.0 in the center of that group. Could you elaborate on those two? The first one is the ground surface.
Yeah, let me talk about the behavior of the group overall. So the single piles are isolated and there's liquefied soil around them. Within the group, we have again, 13 piles, and they're spaced at about 3.2 diameters on center, roughly. In our typical blast-induced liquefaction program, we have a ring of explosive charges, so some diameter of about 30 feet. And all the explosives create a big dish with the greatest settlement in the middle. Normally, that's the normal situation, right? And all the tests we've done. So our group of piles was in the center of this ring of explosives. And instead of seeing that, in the center of the ray where the group was, we saw the least amount of settlement taking place there. Okay, so we had pore pressure transducers inside the group of piles, spaced inside halfway between adjacent piles. And we saw the pore pressures build up. So it had essentially liquefied in those zones, greater than 80% or more. But the ground or inside the group hardly settled at all. It was I don't know, 0.2 to 0.3 inches or something like that. Very small amount of settlement. It's like the piles are holding up that block of soil from settling downward. And we measured the load in each of these piles in the group, and the load distribution in the pile in the center shows very little negative friction until you get towards the very bottom, and then it develops some load. But if we take that, if we take the load that's being transferred from each of the piles into the surrounding soil, or let's say this, if you look at the load in the pile versus depth, and then take that load as a free body and apply it to the surrounding soil, you'll find that you have enough friction acting on that block of soil to hold it up and prevent it from settling downward. And that's exactly what happened. So the group is acting more like a reinforced volume, maybe.
Sure.
In some respects. The piles settled less than the surrounding ground because they go down into a deeper stratum. I think this behavior of the groups is something that we need to understand a little better. We were kind of operating on the good graces of the pile foundation contractor, but we need to look at this a little more closely in the future to see how to explain that. But it looks like we think that's the mechanism that's explaining what's happening.
No, that I mean,
Does
it
that
kind
make
of
sense
makes
to you?
sense. It does make sense. I mean, it's just we kind of we bring into our how we try to analyze things into our preconceived notions, right? That but if but I mean it makes sense that if settling soils impose a downward force on piles,
Yes.
those piles must be resulting a equal and opposite positive or upward force on those soils. And
Yes.
if there's enough of those piles, it will resist that block of soil from moving.
Yeah.
And probably when you only had one pile, there was slip along the pile soil interface because it just punched through it like a pin cushion.
Mm-hmm.
Then when you had a bunch of them, they could handle it without slipping. Does that make sense to you?
That's how I'm taking it, just
Me
like
too.
that. But that's the reason you do test, is because you expect to see something maybe you don't quite understand. And this is what we've seen in this case. It's different than what we would have guessed
Oh.
if we just applied that same negative friction that we see from the single pile to every pile in this group. We would have not got anywhere close to what really happened in the physical test.
Nope. I mean, these are the kind of things that where people really, if they dig into it and they start, I mean, that builds their confidence. They start seeing it. And after you see something behave a certain way, like we just mentioned in our previous part one of this, we talked about lateral behavior. And once you see, for example, a lateral load test way outperform what you might predict with L-pile.
Yeah.
Once you run a load test of a group of piles and you see that the ground surface moves a lot less than you would expect based on probably a free, let's just say, a free field liquefaction induced condition, right?
Yeah.
You begin to say, oh, okay, there is some soil structure interaction here or soil foundation interaction that I could capture, or at least I know my free field is conservative.
Yes.
All right. Let's go to our last segment, Kyle, and we wouldn't really cover all the subjects I want to unless we included just overall the concept of drag load.
Yeah.
I know that's something that you have looked at for many years. You and I both are friends with Beck Felinius, who has done a tremendous amount of work.
Yeah.
But the reality of it is there's still not a consensus.
Right.
I've even looked at modern papers and I find that they're not even really, they're failing to even acknowledge really some of Beck's work. I mean, would you say am I crazy? Am I washed up, or do you think I'm onto something here?
No, I'd agree, because I think the fundamental concepts he's talking about work, right? And it's I guess it's the stages of acceptance of something. The first, that can't be wrong, and then the second is, well, maybe it's right, and the third is so obvious that it's right. How could anyone say it's not right? And we're somewhere in the middle there, where people are starting to acknowledge it and see that it works. The thing that turned the key for the Utah Department of Transportation is that they saw two different design build projects designed entirely differently. One was the Salt Lake I-15 project through Salt Lake Valley, and it was designed in preparation for the Olympics. One of the first big design build projects, 1.2 billion in Salt Lake, with 144 pile supported structures. And it was designed under the concept that you're going to take the static load on the piles, add the negative friction, and that had to have a value that your pile had to be long enough so that you would have a factor of safety of 1.5 or 2 to get be an acceptable pile. So as a result, we got longer piles and more expensive project. Okay, so that's performed fine, you might expect. Then the next design project was just north, and we had some presentations by Bengt and others that were talking about his approach. And so for the next projects, and basically the same kind of compressible soft clays over a sand layer, they used Bengt's approach, which you're not getting a factor of safety of 1.5.
1.5,
It's like
right,
equilibrium, right? You're
Right.
basically under equilibrium. And they're worried about whether the settlement is going to be acceptable if the drag loads develop, and whether you have enough tow resistance to prevent settlement from being excessive, and whether you have enough structural capacity in the piles. So those were the issues. So they designed the road, this highway, with that approach, and just drove the piles and built. They didn't wait for it to settle before driving piles or anything, and so that speed the construction process up considerably as well. Guess what? No problems on that section of the interstate as well, right? So
Right.
we have a whole set of case histories that show that the Bengt's approach, this neutral plane concept, if done properly, leads to safe pile design, even though you don't have a factor of safety of 2
Below the neutral plane.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I will give a shout out to my friends at Minnesota DOT. They've done a lot of work with it, and I know that they have, they undertook, I don't know, it's probably been over 10 years now. They undertook a effort to try to get a grasp on the design using drag load, and I think part of it was that they were getting just wildly different, and I'm making it sound negative, but let's just say they got substantially different approaches, some that made significant dollar amount differences between different design approaches. And they were very, very keenly said, well, we need to get a handle on it. And they have done that. And I believe they have been very successful in applying Bengt's concept of the unified design approach. And there's a lot of folks that are involved, and they all deserve credit. I'll also put a shout out to the Washington DOT, and I think you've probably seen that, where they did a rather extensive study of I think did they do blast induced liquefaction, I think, with some drilled shafts.
Oh.
And they looked at that, and again, they walked away with the same thing, that embracing Bengt's unified design approach. And so, and I mean, now I guess so. Those are the good things. The bad things, I will tell you, and I'm not going to mention names, and this is also a few years ago.
Yeah.
That I was pulled aside, and a group said, we have been performing ground improvement to avoid drag load. It's like, say what? Yeah, we're going in and doing ground improvement around these piles so we don't get drag load. It's like, and then finally, after talking to them for maybe, over a period of a couple of weeks, they're like, so you're telling us that we did all this ground improvement, but we didn't need to. I'm like, I'm not telling you that, but because I don't want to disappoint you. But I think you need to think about what the mechanics are, and realize that, if you do get drag load, it does affect the pile's compression, but a lot of piles are way over designed for structural.
Yeah.
So you may be able to tolerate that. And okay. And a lot of these, we're on a very firm stratum, and settlement really isn't an issue. And so anyway, fortunately, but it's a learning process, right?
Yeah.
But I still, in fact, just recently I saw a paper. It was on drag load. I picked it up and I read it, and they made one reference to Banks' work, and it was his 1972 paper, and I'm like, what? How is that possible?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, it's frustrating. And then the other part of it that maybe we could discuss a little bit of is the AASHTO guidance on using load factors and interpreting the neutral plane, if you want to do that, right? Makes it a little complicated to try and decide. Load and resistance factors complicate the process so that you don't know exactly where you are in comparison to working load analysis, with where you try and figure out the settlement of the pile with that approach.
Well, I guess that's even a bigger question. And
Yeah.
Kyle, and I think that AASHTO, like a lot of folks remember we talked about people going from settlement to coming up with a factor safety of 2 in our last episode.
Yes.
In our last part, I should say, part 1 of 2, we said we think the industry, or at least I thought the industry, had moved from saying, we're worried about settlement, we'll put piles beneath and they'll reduce settlement, to where it was just like black and white, factor safety of 2. And then they said, well, now we got drag load. How do we incorporate drag load in a factor safety of 2? In your opinion, is there any way to incorporate drag load in a factor safety from a geotechnical standpoint? I mean, if I just told you, okay, well, we'll increase the factor safety to 2.5, does that mean anything from a drag load standpoint, or is it 1.5?
Yeah, I don't think it has any great meaning, but it seems like people want. I think the approach that we've been discussing, the unified design approach, is going to give you a settlement, and then you're going to have to decide, is that an acceptable settlement, right? So we have to look at that, and your conservatism probably needs to be associated with that settlement, and possible variations in the QZ curve at the toe of the pile that might affect that. But trying to use load and resistance factors, I know we all want to feel like we've got some safety factor associated with everything, but I think it makes it so you don't know what you're analyzing, and you don't know what your objective is.
Well, you said it best.
Muddled.
You said it best. In Italy, you had a pile, and through blast-induced liquefaction, you induced negative skin friction. It existed. When you performed a top-down test, that negative skin friction reversed and became positive resistance. There is really no rational way for you to say that consider negative skin friction in a geotechnical limit state calculation.
Yeah.
It's just nonsensical. And I mean, I know people can say, well, it's conservative and this and that, but it's probably more than that. I mean, if it makes the piles longer, it's not conservative. It's probably possibly spending money that, that we don't need to spend. And if you really do need to do something, maybe it's not the pile needs to be longer, maybe it needs to be stronger.
Yeah. Or we need to beef up the end of the resistance at the end of the pile, maybe.
Exactly. Yeah. So So
they could use their ground improvement underneath the.
so how do we
underneath the
change
piles.
things, Kyle? How do those of us, and I would call us the somewhat silent minority, at least for now. How do we convince our industry that Bank's principles of unified design are really meaningful? And it's not, they're not intuitive. It's not like something you're going to sit down and read once and go, oh yeah, it's the unchained shear strength is half the unconfined strength. It's not like that. It's kind of like more like it's kind of like you just let it seep into you. It's like getting a sunburn. You got to be exposed to it for a few hours, and then you start kind of understanding what he's got to say. But where do we go with it?
I think there's several directions. The academics, we have our role to play to try and teach the concepts and show the examples so that it's understandable. I think it's one of the more difficult concepts conceptually to get in your head in geotechnical engineering, right? So we've got a lot of moving parts.
There are a lot of moving parts
together.
Not intuitive at all.
And then I think academics publishing papers is useful, but I don't think that's going to seal the deal. Bank's been doing that very capably for years, but we get more and more of us seeing that these same kind of results and publishing those. I think that'll help. But I think we need to have the case histories from the practitioners and like Utah DOT and MnDOT saying, okay, we designed this with this approach, and some of the basic design that they did and that it's performing like it was expected to. This is not with liquefaction, but this is just with consolidation issues, so that people can see, yeah, hey, it worked. So if it worked, we've and they didn't have to make it a factor of safety of 2. Something's happening there. Maybe people catch on with the case histories that could. And this might be, DFI has been very good getting case histories out there, and this might be a good theme for some of the upcoming news articles and journals and so forth. See what we can do to show that this is what's happening. This has been our experience from full-scale design.
I'll give kudos to folks like the PDCA and DFI. Oftentimes we don't think of them as highbrow as ASE, but those groups have been, I think, at the front of the curve on embracing Banked, giving him a platform to share his wealth of information. And probably the next thing is for the next generation to kind of pick up that torch. I still find it a little bit disheartening that so few people are aware of just the mechanics of it. Again, but you give me hope. Kyle, you and I think Rick Kaufman, I know his thoughts on it are very much aligned with ours. Now and I know also even Harry Poulos, who I don't know real well, but I know well enough. I've had a few discussions with him, and I don't know. I'll share with you a little conversation I had with him years ago, and we're talking about drag load, and I said, Harry, do you agree with Banked or do you disagree with Banked? And he goes, oh, I agree with Banked. And I said, really? So, well, I said, okay, so answer me this, Harry. I shouldn't have said that, but I did. I said, Harry, you wrote elastic solutions for what piles, elastic solutions for soil and rock, or
Yeah.
and I said, and in there you have pile settlement in elastic medium. I said, where's the down drag? I said, how is that ever consistent with banks? And he looks at me and he goes, well, you got to pick the right modulus. I shouldn't have, but I said, touche, Harry, that was well done. You answered. That was a good answer. But no, I'm hoping that everybody will embrace it, but it seems like it's only one by one.
Yeah, if it can get into the code documents, I think that's where we will finally make some changes, because people have to do it then, right?
Right. And I have heard that the next AASHTO will have some revisions, but we'll see. So tell me I'll end with this. What is your next big test program? Give us a forecast of what you're planning to do.
Well, the thing we've been working on most recently, it's not necessarily with piles, but it's looking at lightweight cellular concrete. We think it's seeing a lot of usage around the world and for different kinds of projects, and we're investigating its behavior with MSE walls. And it's fun to work on a new material that it's not soil, the cement structure interaction, because it weighs 30 pounds per cubic foot and it has a strength of maybe 60 to 100 psi. So it's in that no man's land between soil and structure, or soil and concrete. So that's where we're working to try and learn how to design this kind of system. We're still doing some work with piles. We need to learn a little bit more about pile groups. It takes some resources to do that, and so we'll see what we can do. But we just have enough information to start to formulate a better design. We've talked before how we're always trying to do the test where there's no problems, that everything is
That's
just
it. That's
gives
it.
us
The perfect
exactly
test.
what we want, the perfect test.
Yeah.
It's like
The elusive.
yeah, like hitting a hole in one.
Oh, and it
Right,
always,
yeah.
it's like it's like trying to hold grains of sand. There's just you figure this out, and then something else slips by.
Yeah.
No, it's funny that you mentioned, and I thought I'd just, in closing, you had mentioned even trying to make sure your calibration of your load cell and your readout makes sense. And years ago, I was on a test. This was probably over 15 years ago. We were on a test. We loaded a pile up. It was supposed to fail at, like, I don't know, 250 kips or something. It wasn't very hard. We loaded it, the first load level, we went up to the very max level because somebody had put the wrong calibration into the load cell readout. And so it was like, and I knew something was wrong in my brain, but I'm sitting there looking, it's like supposed to be like, it's like, 5, 7 kips, 10 kips. And instead it was like 85 kips, 90 kips. I'm like, and then before, and
nothing is no settlement.
Oh yeah. And of course it screwed up all our strain gauges. It was just a disaster, but the elusive test, test. All right. Kyle, thanks again. I hope that I enjoyed this. I hope you did. And I hope our listeners, they this is a great chance for them to sit in my shoes and pick your brain.
Yeah, it's been fun to talk with you, Tim. It's always enlightening, and thanks for doing this. It's a huge service, big service to our profession and to DFI and all geotechnical engineers.
All right. Well, that concludes our first episode of Deep Dive. And thanks everybody for listening. And we'll talk to you next time. Take care. Bye.
On behalf of DFI, we hope you enjoyed this episode. The views, information, and opinions expressed during Deep Foundation Institute's podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of DFI. DFI does not verify or take responsibility for the accuracy of the information contained, nor does it warrant that the information contained herein is suitable for any general or specific use. The podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. Editing, modification, or redistribution of this podcast is prohibited. Thank you for your time. Keep on surviving.